Lesson 10-1, Squares and Square Roots. We're going to talk a little bit about what those terms mean. I want to mention the term perfect square. A perfect square is a number that is a product of a number times itself. They're called perfect squares. Sometimes they're just called squares. So if you would see that on an I-STEP test, a square of a number, or is that number a square, it means is it a perfect square. Square rooting, it's when you take a number and you put that radical sign around it, and you want to know what number times itself gives us that. Well, some of them, if they're a perfect square, you'll get an integer. If it's not, you either have to estimate without a calculator or you have to be able to use a calculator, and we're going to do both things today. So I want you to actually create a list on the side of your notes that continue this list on that we're going to start here. 1 squared means 1 times 1, which is 1. 1 is a perfect square because if I square root 1, it comes out to the integer 1 because I know 1 times 1 gave it to me. 2 squared, what's 2 squared? 4. 4 is a perfect square because if I square root 4 then, that comes back to an integer of 2. 3 squared is 9. And then the square root of 9 is 3. 4 squared is 16. And we would know then that the square root of 16 is 4. 5 squared is 25. So the square root of 25 would be 5. Now, what I had mentioned on the side of your paper, you want to continue a list of perfect squares. You're going to need it for the part where we estimate. So on the side of your paper, I want you to do 1, 4, 9, 16, 25. Who can tell me what the next number in this list would be? 36. What would be next? 49. What would be next? 64. Next. 81. Next. 100. Does everybody in here know how you can continue that list? You may not know them all in your head. You might have to use either multiply it out on paper or a calculator, but do you know where we're getting that list? No. That is a list of perfect squares. And as we continue on, the next one would be 11 times 11, 121. And then 12 times 12, 144. So to do the estimation part, the part without a calculator, you will need to continue that list a little bit on your own. All right, let's talk now about what we're doing with these. First of all, I had mentioned the term radical sign. That symbol that performs the square root operation is actually called a radical. When people see it, they say square root of because that's what it does, and that's fine. But that actual symbol itself is called a radical. All right, now let me show you a couple of different things that can happen when they ask you to perform the square root operation. If you would have just the square root of 36 with nothing else around it, they really want you to answer 6. That means that the principal square root of 36. So most people would instantly think of 6. Now there's another one. There's another square root of 36. There's another number times itself that gives you 36, and that would be negative 6. We'll talk about when you have to put that on your own or when you have to be told to put that. So if you're just seeing a simplifying problem like this one right here, and it says square root of 36, you put 6. If there is a negative in front, that means it wants the negative of the principal square root, so you would put negative 6. Okay, this thing right here doesn't even look like it's finished. It's plus minus. If it says plus minus the square root of 36, well then by all means you have to put plus or minus 6. So go by the symbol in front. And then this last one says the square root of negative 36. The negative's inside. Okay, we are going to say on that not possible right now. Okay, not possible. Believe it or not, when you get a little further on in math, mainly Algebra 2, it becomes possible kind of in a strange way. Negative square roots, we could deal with it with something called I, an imaginary number, but you don't need to worry about that. If you have a square root of a negative right now, you're just going to say not possible or it can't be done. Don't say it's 0 because that's not true, but it's not possible. Questions about any of that? So you have your list. This next part without a calculator. Okay, so when you take it on a quiz or a test, you will not be allowed to use a calculator on this part. It says find 2 consecutive integers between which each square root lies, then estimate to the nearest integer. So this first one says square root of 34. Look at our list over there on the left-hand side. Where does 34 fit in between? What 2 numbers? 25 and 36. So here's what I'm going to do. Find 2 consecutive integers between which each square root lies. So I'm going to put 25 on the left of it and 36 on the right of it. Okay, those are the integers, the perfect squares that it's between, but what I really need to know is what the square root of those numbers are, because we want to know what the square root of 34 is closest to. So square root of 25 is 5 and the square root of 36 is 6. So square root of 34 we know is between 5 and 6. Now here's how you make your decision. 34, is it closer to 25 or 36? 36. So this one would be what you'd estimate it to. So it's between 5 and 6, but 6 is the one that it's closest to. Square root of 83. Which 2 perfect squares is that between, Braxton?
81 and 100.
81 and 100. Okay, well, we don't want to know the perfect squares it's between. We want to know the square roots. So the square root of 81, Braxton, is what?
9.
And the square root of 100 is?
10.
And is 83 closer to 81 or 100?
81.
Yeah, so we're going to say that the estimate of the square root of 83 is closest to 9. All right, any questions about doing those without a calculator? If those numbers get bigger, you will have to extend your list. And do you understand how to do that? All right, let's go look at some others. These you might have to use a calculator. Use a calculator to find each square root to the nearest tenth. So you not only have to use a calculator, you have to pay attention to the signs in front. So square root of 7, now most calculators, you have a button that looks like this, usually x squared here, and then right above it you see the square root sign in a different color. Usually it's actually light blue on the ones that we have here in class. So in order to make the light blue thing to happen, you've got to go up to the top of the calculator and hit the second key, which is also in the same color, and that will make the square root happen. So if you're going to use one of the calculators in class, that's what you'll have to do. You might be able to use a calculator on your Chromebook if you find one that does square roots. So square root of 7, if I put that in here, it comes out to 2.645. Whoops, 457. And then there's a few more, but it says right here to round to the nearest tenth. So we would round that to 2.6. All right, next, square root of 67 8.1853 and we'll round that to the nearest tenth. The 8 says for the 1 to go up, so 8.2. The next one has a plus or minus in front of it. Well, that means in your answer you have to put a plus or minus with that, but I'm still going to go ahead and use my calculator and say square root of 45, and that gives me 6.708 plus some other digits, but rounding to the nearest tenth, I'm going to say, and I have to say plus or minus in front of it, 6.7. Don't forget the sign, and don't forget to round correctly. And then last but not least, we're going to do square root of 120. And this one comes out to 10.954. Okay, so be careful on this. The 5 says to do what? Round up, which makes the 9 go up to 10. So you would actually have to write 11.0. Remember the rule that if it tells you to round to the nearest tenth and it ends up being a 0, you've got to at least have something in that spot if you've rounded, and we've rounded, so you've got to put a 0 there. So it's actually 11.0, not just 11. Okay, the next problem, solve each equation, round to the nearest tenth if necessary. So this kind of changes the game. It's just not a simplify and there's a square root sitting there. It's saying actually solve this. So when you have to actually solve, you got to think about all possibilities. So anytime we've had to solve an equation, you got to get the variable alone. This says x squared. We don't want x squared, we just want x. So we've always do the opposite of what you see. The opposite of squaring is square rooting. So you have to square root both sides. So square root and square are opposite symbols. Question? Oh, x. And then this is where you must put plus or minus. And what's the square root of 36? 6. Plus or minus 6. This happens when you're solving an equation. You have to consider both. X squared equals 42, so we want x alone. We square root both sides. And I've got to say plus or minus. Well, when I square root 42, it comes out to 6.480. And this says round to the nearest tenth, so I'm going to say plus or minus 6.5. Okay, questions on that? So make sure when you get to the equation part, you put plus or minus. And I can tell you for a fact, this portion will be on the I-STEP test, and they will be checking to see if you know you got to consider both answers in an equation. So you got to have both.